Hi everyone, in this last video for this week I'm going to talk about the progressive presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. So we're going to begin with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was born into wealth in the East Coast. He grew up as a sickly child who, through his own energy and determination, inspired by his father, became an intellectual giant and studied at Harvard, and also became physically active and robust, actions that carried over into his presidency. His political career seems ready to take off right as soon as he graduates from Harvard. But then he suffers the double tragedy of the death of his mother and his wife within a very short space of time, and so he leaves the East Coast and goes and becomes a cattle rancher in the Dakotas. He returns to fight in the Spanish-American War, becomes a national hero, re-enters politics, becomes McKinley's vice president, and becomes president when McKinley is assassinated. Roosevelt is going to be really key to understanding America in the 20th and the 21st centuries, in particular the office of the presidency, because Roosevelt is the one who moves away from the Gilded Age idea of the president kind of implementing what Congress the agenda that Congress is pursuing. Instead, for Roosevelt, the president is supposed to be a leader and a figurehead, and is supposed to drive the national political agenda, and is supposed to be a model. He's supposed to be someone who teaches Americans the values of citizenship, or the values of America. This wasn't an approach to the presidency that had really been seen approached or carried out by any president in the past other than Lincoln. As president, Roosevelt is going to continue to support and to emphasize progressive causes, beginning with his program called the Square Deal. The Square Deal is that every American has equal opportunity and equal justice under the law, that corporations and the abuses of corporations, powerful corporations, are going to be tamed, that American natural resources are going to be protected, and that food is going to be regulated. And so we see, first of all, that Roosevelt is willing to take on the big trust companies like JP Morgan, and he wins Supreme Court cases that enables him to break them apart. And we see him take the same approach with mining companies and with railroads in defending laborers, defending their right to strike, defending increases in their pay and decreases in their hours. Roosevelt's also going to be responsible for many of the state parks and national forests that we know today, and protecting aspects of American natural beauty. He's also responsible for the first regulations of the food industry. This is a classic example of a progressive era policy that was unnecessary in earlier eras when Americans grew most of their own food, or when they lived in the countryside. Now that more and more Americans are living in cities, they're eating food that has come to them from a long way away, that's been processed by people who are making money from processing the food. Abuses have crept in. Health practices have deteriorated, and Roosevelt sees that it's the responsibility of the federal government to prevent these abuses and to protect people from eating unsanitary food. When Roosevelt moves on from the presidency, he encourages Republicans and the nation to adopt his hand-picked successor, longtime friend William Taft, as his successor. And the American people do, and Taft is elected. Taft is an experienced public figure. He served in the army, he served in government, but he's never held elected office. He's not really a politician. Although he pursues some aspects of Roosevelt's agenda, he lacks Roosevelt's charisma. Basically, everyone would have looked uncharismatic in comparison to Roosevelt. And so there are different opinions on what happens next. What we know happens is that Roosevelt comes back, determines to run for president again. Taft refuses to give way, and so Roosevelt forms his own progressive party that will split the Republican vote in the election. in the 1912 election. Some people have said this was because Roosevelt was unhappy with Taft, that he felt Taft had betrayed progressive policies. Others have said it's because Roosevelt was an egomaniac and couldn't stand not being in public life and in the public eye. I'm going to leave that up to you, but the end result is that we have the first instance of a Democratic president, a democratically controlled House, and a democratically controlled Senate, with Southern Democrats since the Civil War. The administration of Woodrow Wilson comes to power because Roosevelt splits the Republican vote between himself and Taft. Woodrow Wilson is a highly educated man. He is from the South. He is highly religious. He is also messianic. He sees himself as called to lead America by God. He is going to continue to drive progressive policies, actually very successfully during his presidency. Someone who understood how government worked, was very efficient in using it. And so he is able to reduce tariffs significantly, tariffs on about 1,000 different items. And so this issue of the tariffs has been something that's been going on for a long time in American history. And Wilson's justification is that we've had tariffs for a long time. They were designed to give American industries a start against more established industries. Now we need to lower prices for Americans who are buying goods rather than making goods. And so the tariffs are reduced. To make up the revenue that's lost from the tariffs, the government promotes and successfully sees ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. 16th Amendment to the Constitution that permits the leveling of a federal income tax. So the rebalancing that you're seeing happening here is away from revenue to the government coming from manufacturers and revenue instead coming from consumers. So it's not so much those who are making goods who are paying extra, but those who are buying the goods. So, reduction of tariffs, ratification of the 16th Amendment, two important progressive measures, and then the third and the most significant progressive measure is Wilson's development of the Federal Reserve. Now, the United States had a national bank in the time of its founding under Hamilton. Jefferson didn't like it, allowed it to expire. A second national bank was created, and Jackson didn't like it and allowed it to expire. And since then, the United States had not had a national government, just a conglomeration of state and local banks that produced their own currency. But this meant that when you had an economic panic, often these banks ran out of money. And would go bankrupt, people would lose their savings. So the idea of creating a federal bank, which becomes known as the Federal Reserve, is that in times of shortage and crisis, the Federal Reserve can print money and can relieve the pressure on the monetary supply. But it also gives the Federal Reserve significant control and influence over the economy of the United States. And so this is the third great progressive measure that Wilson achieves.